Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Before we get started today, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And, the drill, click the bell icon to make sure you don't miss any future deep dives. We have a really fascinating topic lined up today, something that's super relevant whether you're prepping for exams like the UPSC or just curious about India in general. It's all about regionalism.
Regionalism, it's a pretty loaded word, isn't it? I mean, you hear it everywhere.
It really is. And it's one of those things that can be uh, tricky to really wrap your head around.
Yeah, exactly. Because on the one hand, you've got this incredible diversity in India, all
Mm.
these different languages, cultures, and, ways of life.
Right. And that diversity is something to celebrate, right? I mean, it's part of what makes India so unique.
Absolutely. But then you have this idea of unity, of being one nation, and that's where regionalism comes in, because it's about how these different regions with their own distinct identities fit into the larger picture of India.
So it's like this balancing act, right,
Wow.
between unity and diversity.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
So to get us started, maybe we should define what we're talking about here. What exactly is regionalism?
Well, I think a good place to begin is to think about it as a really strong sense of identification with a particular region.
Okay, so it's about feeling connected to a specific place, to a particular part of India.
Yeah, exactly. And it often goes beyond just geography.
What do you mean?
Well, it's often tied to things like language, culture, history, those shared experiences and traditions that make a region distinct.
So it's about identity, but also, I'm guessing it's about power and resources too, right? Like, who gets to control what within a particular region?
You got it. It's about the desire for that region to have more autonomy, more control over its own affairs. And sometimes it can even lead to demands for a separate identity or even a separate state.
Yeah, we've definitely seen examples of that in India's history, haven't we? Like the Khalistan movement or the demands for a separate Bodo land. Those are pretty extreme examples of how regional aspirations can challenge national unity.
Definitely. And those examples highlight how regionalism can be a really complex issue. It can be a force for positive change, pushing for the development of a region, especially if it feels neglected by the central government.
So it's like a way for regions to have their voices heard, to make sure their needs are being met.
Exactly. But as those examples show, it can also become a source of tension and even conflict. It's a delicate balance. And to really understand how we got here, I think it's important to look at the historical context of regionalism in India.
Okay, so history lesson time. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it's important to remember that India has always been incredibly diverse.
That's true. It's like baked into the DNA of the country, isn't it?
Exactly. Different languages, cultures, religions, even landscapes. They've always made India a land of distinct regions. And even before independence, these differences were often amplified by, the policies of the British.
You're talking about that whole divide and rule strategy, right?
Exactly. By organizing India into presidencies and provinces based on regional distinctions, the British, even if unintentionally, ended up fostering this sense of regional consciousness. And then, after independence, India's leaders were faced with this, enormous challenge of integrating all these diverse regions into a unified nation.
Yeah, that must have been a massive undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. And it led to some pretty big moments in India's history, events that reshaped the map, and they continue to influence regionalism even today.
Okay, so like what are we talking about here?
Well, for example, think about Patti Sriamalu's fast in the 1950s. His sacrifice for a separate state for Telugu-speaking people ultimately led to the creation of Andhra Pradesh, the very first state to be formed based on linguistic lines.
And that kind of set off a chain reaction, didn't it?
It did. In 1956, we saw the States Reorganization Act, which redrew state boundaries to better align with linguistic groups.
And those changes, they didn't stop there, did they?
Not at all. The Northeastern States Reorganization Act in the 1970s, the formation of states like Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Uttarakhand in 2000, and of course more recently the creation of Telangana in 2014.
Wow, so regional aspirations have really shaped the political landscape of India. It's a dynamic process.
It really is, and it shows us that regionalism is not some static thing, it's constantly evolving.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop of regionalism, but it seems like it's not just about demanding separate states, right? It can take on different forms within India.
You're absolutely right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. We can actually see regionalism playing out in, like, three main ways. What we call superstate, interstate, and intrastate regionalism.
Okay, so three different levels of regionalism. Let's break those down a bit.
Sure. So let's start with, let's say, intrastate regionalism. Imagine, like, a movement within a state pushing for a specific area to have more control or even become a separate state.
So it's regionalism, but happening within the borders of a single state.
Yeah, exactly. And the reasons behind it, they can vary. Sometimes it's about, feeling neglected in terms of development, while other times it's driven by like this desire to protect a really distinct cultural or linguistic identity.
Got it. Okay, so then what about interstate regionalism? What's that all about?
Think about like the Kaveri water dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. That's a prime example. It's basically states, butting heads.
Butting heads over what?
Well, it could be over resources like the Kaveri water dispute or boundaries or even cultural differences. It's kind of like a sibling rivalry, but on a state level.
And those disputes can get pretty heated, can't they? Especially when we're talking about something as essential as water.
Oh, absolutely. Water's life, right?
Okay.
And then finally, we have superstate regionalism. This is where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's superstate regionalism?
Well, imagine multiple states coming together, forming like this united front to tackle issues that affect them collectively.
Okay, so it's like regionalism, but on a bigger scale.
Yeah. So, for example, the northeastern states, they often present a united voice on issues like, development or security, which impact the whole region.
Ah, I see. So it's about cooperation, not conflict.
Right. And it just goes to show that regionalism isn't always about division. It can also be about, collective action.
I like that. Okay, so we've got these different levels of regionalism from within a state, between states, to even across multiple states. But, what I find interesting is it's not always about demanding completely separate states. There are other ways regionalism expresses itself, right?
That's a great point. It can be much more subtle than that. I mean, think about it. Karnataka having its own state flag.
Right. It's like a symbolic way of asserting their regional identity.
Exactly. And then you have states like Karnataka, Goa, and Andhra Pradesh implementing these local reservation policies and jobs, prioritizing the sons of the soil.
Ah, yes, the sum of the soil doctrine. Now, that's something I always found really interesting and a bit controversial, too, if I'm being honest.
Oh, absolutely. It's this idea that people native to a particular region, they should have preferential access to jobs and resources in that region.
And that idea has fueled some pretty influential movements in India, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Think about like the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra or the MNS. They've both used that son of the soil rhetoric to, advance their agendas. But it's also sparked debates about, fairness and inclusion, especially for migrants from other parts of India who might feel excluded by those policies.
Right. And then, of course, you have things like demands for special category status for certain states.
Yeah, that's another way this whole regionalism thing plays out. And it often boils down to this feeling of economic disadvantage, of being left behind in terms of development.
So those states are basically saying, hey, we need a little extra help to catch up.
Exactly. Because states with that special category status, they get more financial assistance and tax breaks from the central government. So it's a big deal for those who feel like they need a little extra support.
So we've got this really complex mix of things feeding into regionalism. Cultural identity, political power, economic factors. It's not just one thing. It's a whole web of interconnected issues.
You got it. It's messy. It's complicated. And that's why it's so important to, recognize that complexity if we want to really understand the challenges and opportunities that regionalism presents for India. Because it's a force that can shape the nation's destiny in both good ways and, not so good ways.
Absolutely. And I think the big question that's probably on everyone's mind now is WHY. Why does regionalism persist in India? I mean, we keep seeing these sentiments and movements pop up, even today. Why is that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to understand that why, we need to dig a little deeper. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone.
So we talked about what regionalism is, looked back at its roots, and even unpacked all the different ways it shows up in India. But the big question lingering, at least for me, is like, WHY? Why does this keep coming up? Why is regionalism still such a big deal in India, even today?
Yeah, it's the question, right? And the answer, well, it's not simple. There are so many layers to it. It's like peeling an onion. It's not just about squabbles over borders or who gets what resources. It goes way deeper than that. We have to look at the social fabric, the economic realities, even the psychology of it all.
Okay, so walk me through it. What are some of those deeper reasons why regionalism just won't quit in India?
One of the biggest drivers, I think, is this feeling of being left behind. It's like, imagine some regions zooming ahead on the development highway while others are stuck on a bumpy side road. That creates resentment, a sense of, hey, that's not fair.
Makes sense. If you see other parts of the country reaping the benefits of progress while your region struggles, you're bound to feel a bit disgruntled.
Exactly. And it's not just about cold, hard economic numbers. It's about people's actual lives. It's about seeing others benefit more from national policies, more investments, better opportunities, while your own area feels stuck.
And I'm guessing those feelings of being left out, they're made even worse when you factor in all the existing social and economic inequalities within states themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Things like limited access to education, healthcare that's not up to par, basic infrastructure lacking in some areas. All of that just piles on, makes those feelings of disadvantage even stronger.
So when people feel like they're not getting a fair shake, they start clinging even tighter to their regional identity. It becomes a way to say, hey, we're here too and we deserve better.
It's like a cry for recognition. And it's important to remember that it's not always about wanting to break away from India completely. A lot of times it's about wanting a bigger slice of the pie, more say in how things are run, recognition of their region's unique culture and identity. It's about feeling valued and respected within the larger nation.
And that's where the whole political aspect comes in, doesn't it? I mean, regional parties, they often tap into those regional sentiments, right?
Oh, they sure do. They can become powerful voices for those regional aspirations, fighting for their region's needs on the national stage. But there's a flip side to that coin, too.
Meaning.
Well, sometimes those regional parties can exploit those sentiments, use them for their own game, stir up divisions to win elections, even if it doesn't really solve the underlying problems.
So it's a bit of a tightrope walk. On one hand, they can give a voice to legitimate concerns, but on the other, there's the risk of them using regionalism just as a tool for political gamesmanship.
You hit the nail on the head, and that political dimension, it just adds another layer of complexity to this whole regionalism thing. It makes it even harder to figure out the best way forward.
Okay, so we've got economic disparities, social inequalities, political maneuvering, all feeding into why regionalism persists. The question I keep coming back to is it a good thing or a bad thing for India? I mean, it seems like it can cut both ways. Push for progress in some areas, but create division in others.
$1 million question, right? And there's no easy answer. It's a bit of a paradox. It's like most things in life, regionalism has a dual nature. It can be a force for good, but it also has the potential to be disruptive. It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance, where it can contribute to the nation's progress without tearing it apart.
So let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with the potential upside.
Oh,
How can regionalism actually be a positive force in India?
well, for starters, it can be a real catalyst for development, especially in those regions that have historically been overlooked. Think about it. When people have that strong regional pride, they're more likely to roll up their sleeves, advocate for change, and fight for their region to get its fair share.
So it's like a driving force, pushing for better infrastructure, education, healthcare, more economic opportunities,
Yeah.
all the things that make a difference in people's lives.
Exactly. It empowers regions to take charge of their own destinies. And by bringing regional issues to the forefront, it forces those in power to pay attention and hopefully allocate resources accordingly. I mean, even the creation of new states, like we talked about earlier, is often a direct result of this push for regional development.
Right. It's like giving regions more control over their own affairs, which should ideally lead to better outcomes for everyone.
That's the idea. And it's not just about the economy either. Regionalism can also play a big role in preserving and promoting India's incredible cultural diversity. It allows regions to celebrate their unique languages, traditions, art forms, all those things that add to the richness of Indian culture as a whole.
Okay, so we've got the good stuff, development and cultural preservation. But we've also talked about the flip side, those potential negatives of regionalism. What are some of the dangers there?
Well, one of the biggest worries is that it can undermine national unity. When those regional identities become too strong, too dominant, it can create this us versus them dynamic.
And that can lead to,
Suspicion, distrust, even hostility towards people from other regions. And we've seen this play out in some really unfortunate ways. Think about the violence that's erupted against migrants in some parts of India, fueled by that son of the soil mentality we talked about.
yeah, that's a dark side of regionalism that we can't ignore. It can turn ugly real fast.
It can. And beyond the immediate violence and unrest, it can also create long-term challenges. For example, it can make it harder to implement national policies, to get states to cooperate on things that require a collective effort.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, think about those interstate river water disputes or coordinating responses to natural disasters. Excessive regionalism, it can create these roadblocks, slowing down progress for everyone.
Hmm.
It's like each region is pulling in a different direction, and the nation as a whole struggles to move forward.
Yeah, I see your point. It's like too much emphasis on regional interests can turn into a tug of war that weakens the whole fabric of the nation.
Exactly. And that tension between regional aspirations and national unity, it's at the heart of this whole debate around regionalism.
It's like trying to balance on a seesaw, right? Too much weight on one side or the other, and the whole thing tips over.
Perfect analogy. And finding that balance, that sweet spot, it's crucial for India's success. But how do we do that? How do we make sure that regional aspirations don't turn into a force that divides us? What can we do to make this whole thing work?
Welcome back to the deep dive. So
Mhm.
we've really dug into this whole regionalism thing, explored the good, the bad, the complicated. But now, the million-dollar question, what do we do with all of this? How do we walk that tightrope, between embracing regional diversity and keeping India united?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's about finding ways to make this whole regionalism thing work for India, not against it. To use its energy to drive progress, not division. And honestly, I think it's going to take a whole society effort. It can't just be the government's responsibility. We need civil society, educational institutions, even each of us as individuals to play our part.
So it's like a team effort. Everyone's got to pitch in.
Exactly. But let's start with the government. One of the most important things they can do is tackle those regional imbalances, those economic and social disparities we talked about earlier. Because when people feel like they're getting a fair shake, it goes a long way in reducing resentment and, making them feel more connected to the nation as a whole.
So it's about making sure development reaches every corner of India, not just a select few.
Exactly. And there have been some efforts in that direction, like the Backward Region Grant Fund, the
Mm.
BRGF, that's specifically designed to target development in those backward districts. It focuses on things like improving infrastructure, creating jobs, making sure people have access to basic services like education and healthcare.
And I think there's also the PMKKKY, right? The one that's focused on those mining areas. It seems like there are programs in place, but are they really enough? I mean, I always wonder about implementation,
Right.
actually getting things done on the ground.
Yeah, you're hitting on a crucial point. Having policies on paper is one thing, but translating them into real, tangible change, that's a whole other ballgame. You need good governance, transparency, accountability, and you need to really understand the unique challenges each region faces.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem, it's about making sure those resources are used effectively, reaching the people who need them most. But beyond those economic measures, what about education? What role can education play in all of this?
Education is huge honestly. It's about shaping mindsets,
Yeah.
building a sense of shared identity. We need a curriculum that not only teaches facts and figures, but also encourages critical thinking, empathy, respect for diversity.
So it's about teaching kids to appreciate the incredible tapestry of cultures and languages we have in India, while also understanding that ultimately we're all part of one nation.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating this sense of Indianness that embraces those differences instead of seeing them as something to be afraid of. And that education, it needs to start early, from the very beginning.
Right? Like plant those seeds early on. And along with formal education, I think the media has a big role to play too, right? In shaping how people view regionalism.
Oh, for sure. The media needs to be responsible, promoting balanced and nuanced discussions, not just sensationalizing things or pitting regions against each other. They need to highlight stories of cooperation, success stories, and foster this sense of national pride.
It's about telling the right stories, the ones that build bridges instead of walls. But even with the government, education, the media all doing their part, it ultimately comes down to individuals, doesn't it? To
Mhm.
us, to how we choose to see this whole regionalism thing.
Couldn't agree more. Each one of us can make a choice, to challenge our own biases, to be open to understanding different perspectives, to remember that our regional identity is only one part of who we are. We're also Indians, and that shared identity, it's something we need to hold on to.
So it's about celebrating those differences while also recognizing the things that unite us. Understanding that a strong India is one where all its regions feel valued, empowered, part of something bigger.
Yeah, and maybe instead of thinking of India as a melting pot where everyone has to blend in, we should see it more like a mosaic, where each piece is distinct, has its own unique color and pattern, but together they create this beautiful, vibrant whole.
That's a really great image. And I think that's the key takeaway here. Regionalism, it's not inherently good or bad. It's about what we make of it. It's about finding that balance where regional aspirations and national unity can work together, like two sides of the same coin, propelling India forward.
Well said. It's a journey, a continuous process of talking, understanding, and, yeah, sometimes compromise. But ultimately, it's up to the Indian people to decide where that journey leads.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into regionalism in India. It's been quite a journey, exploring all the twists and turns, the challenges, the opportunities.
It has. It's been great diving deep with everyone today.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, understanding these complex issues, that's the first step towards finding solutions. So stay curious, keep learning, and keep exploring. Until next time.